Kia ora, everyone. Uh, you are in the right place if you're here for Privacy Week's webinar on privacy and cybersecurity related myths. We are just going to give it a couple minutes, allow some other people to join us, and then we will get started. Just another minute, let some people trickle in, and then we'll get underway. Still a few people just trickling on in there. 30 seconds or so, and we'll kick this webinar off. Alrighty, looks like our numbers have steadied out a little bit, so we'll get started. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to Privacy Week webinar on busting privacy-related and cybersecurity myths with CERT New Zealand. My name is Sam Leggett. I've been with CERT New Zealand about 3 years in their threat and incident response team. So, who is CERT New Zealand? We'll start there. CERT New Zealand is a government organisation all about cybersecurity. They work with individuals, they work with businesses to help improve cybersecurity and cyber resilience for all New Zealanders. There's an incident response function there. We have an online reporting form that anyone can use to report a cybersecurity incident to us. That can be an individual, that can be a business, and we produce a lot of resources to raise understanding around cybersecurity. One resource that I'll mention quite a bit today is the Own Your Online website that CERT New Zealand has. We can find a lot of resources and information and guides on cybersecurity in a bit more accessible language, not the super technical speak. We also do a lot of work in terms of scam preventions, initiatives, awareness raising around a lot of these things. And we work with a lot of key industry partners to try and achieve that. All the data that we receive through the reporting that we have, we try to put that back out so that we can raise awareness around the emerging cybersecurity threats as well. So, what's the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy? Well, under the Privacy Act 2020, as I'm sure you all know, organizations have a lot of obligations in terms of personal information and privacy obligations around that information. And essentially, cybersecurity is how you go about protecting that information, how you go about meeting those privacy obligations. And strong cybersecurity can go a long way in keeping that information, that data nice and secure and maintaining those privacy obligations. As a result of cybersecurity attacks, when we don't have great cybersecurity, that's often where privacy breaches, leaks, and data loss can occur. Some big ticket attacks that you may have heard of are things like ransomware, and that's often where data is exfiltrated by an attacker and then put out online. Obviously, there's some pretty significant privacy breaches going against those obligations under the Privacy Act there. Cybersecurity is how we keep that information nice and safe. The reality is everyone uses the internet today. And so cybersecurity is much more part of our day-to-day lives, even as individuals, but especially as organizations where we have those obligations to make sure our customer information, our customer data is kept nice and secure. There are some common cybersecurity myths out there, and if you subscribe to any of these, that's totally understandable. But the information that we have, the data that we have at CERT New Zealand, actually shows that a lot of these are not the case. So the really common one that we often see people having is that cyber attackers are only going after the really big targets, the big organizations that have heaps of information, lots of money, lots of resources, really high value organizations. Actually, more often than not, what we're seeing is that cyber attackers are going after low-hanging fruit. They're trying to walk through the doors that are left open. So where organizations have poor cybersecurity, there's a few gaps that they've left in that space. Those are the options. Those are the targets that attackers are really going after these days. The less effort required to get in, to actually breach that organization, get that information, the more payoff that they're going to get for less effort. The other myth that people often subscribe to is that just having systems and software in place, things like antivirus software, that's enough, right? That's the only defense we need, and that's going to keep us nice and safe from everything. One thing that we often talk about in cybersecurity is a defense in depth model. And so that's layering defense on top of one another. The more defensive layers that we have, the more secure our systems are, the more safe that information that we need to keep private as part of our privacy obligations is kept. And then the other one is that the impacts of cybersecurity threats are actually inevitable, unavoidable. If an attacker comes after you, there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. They're going to get into your systems, and they're going to get access to that information. The good news, unfortunately, what we're going to go through today is some of the scary stuff, the bad things that can happen, how that privacy can be breached, how that data can be breached. The good news is we're going to end up with some really simple steps that everyone can take to improve their own cybersecurity. And the other really cool part of this is that this isn't just for organizations. These tips that we're going to talk about can be implemented in your personal life as well to keep you and your family, your friends nice and secure too. All right, so let's look at a bit of data that we have here at CERT New Zealand first. Who are the cyber attackers targeting? Why? How? How's it all going down? In 2023, the most reported issues to CERT New Zealand were phishing and credential harvesting, and now that's the most reported issue to CERT New Zealand across all our yearly reporting, quarterly reporting. That's number one, always has been, likely always will be. And the reason that that's so high is because that's often the initial vector of how an attacker gets into the system. So what do we mean by phishing and credential harvesting? Phishing is just ultimately the act of an attacker, a scammer, pretending to be an organization that they're not, trying to get you to provide some kind of personal information. Now, this may be through a phone call, this may be through an email, this may be through a text message. It's the same kind of methodology. They pretend to be a reputable organization. If it's an email or text, they may send you a link, ask you to click on that link, and ask you to provide some personal information. A lot of the time, what they're asking for are login credentials. So things like your username and your password. And if they're able to capture that, especially for an organization, that is often the number one most common way that an attacker will get into an organization's environment and then be able to steal or exfiltrate that data. The second most reported category is scams and fraud. Now, that's a pretty broad category. There's a lot that falls under that, and that's where a lot of our financial loss that's reported to CERT New Zealand also sits. The third one that we're talking about is unauthorized access. Now, this is something that can occur after phishing has occurred. So you receive that phishing text message. Unfortunately, you've clicked on that link. You provided your username and your password. The attacker will then take that username and password, use it to gain unauthorized access to your own online accounts, your organizational accounts and environments, things like that. The fourth one there is malware. And malware is, again, a pretty broad category. We're going to talk about that a little bit specifically in a bit of time here. Malware can be things from information stealers, keyloggers, spyware, adware, even all the way to ransomware. Ransomware specifically, let's get a few there, we are going to talk about in a little bit of time. Now, I mentioned financial loss earlier. This is the number one metric for loss that we see in cybersecurity. There are definitely other types of loss going on here, and we're going to talk about that too. But financial loss is the one that we can put a very easy metric on. Yeah, it's a number. We can tally up that number, and we can kind of get an understanding of what the impact is as a result of these types of things. Scams and fraud accounted for 86% of the loss in 2023, 15.7 million. Now, that's a pretty large sum of money, but what I will call attention to here is that is really only scratching the surface. CERT New Zealand can only report back on the amount of things that are reported to CERT New Zealand. The reality is, and we know this from talking to key partners like banks and other organizations, the amount of financial loss occurring as a result of scams, fraud, and cybersecurity incidents is probably well over 10 times this number. So talking with a few banks in New Zealand, we suspect that the number of financial loss in a year is probably upwards of $200 million. And that's a huge sum of money for New Zealanders to be losing when there are things that we can do to keep ourselves safe. The rest, less than 20% was from unauthorized transfers. So that's essentially where an attacker gains that unauthorized access that we talked about, can get into something like a bank account and can transfer that money out of the bank account themselves. The rest is actually where people are being targeted. People are essentially what's being attacked, not the technology. So this is things like phishing, where they ask you to provide your credit card details. They can then take that, they can then take money out. Actually, what this more captures is where someone has been convinced to make a transfer to someone that is malicious. Think of all the scams that this might cover. Dating and romance is a big one, where someone starts to build a relationship with their target. Eventually, they start asking for money. The target provides it. They've made the decision to make that transfer, but actually they've been coerced, they've been fooled, they've been tricked into doing so. And this captures quite a lot of financial loss. And what this really highlights is that often it is people that's targeted, not the technology. And that's the same with something like phishing and credential harvesting. Rather than going after the technology, rather than trying to exploit some kind of vulnerability in the technology, what they're actually doing is targeting the people, trying to get information out of the people, and then using that information to gain access. The other type of data that we collect is incidents specifically affecting organizations. And this is really where the crossover with privacy takes place. Obviously, those organizations have an obligation to keep customer information private and secure. So what are the types of things that organizations specifically are seeing? No huge surprise, phishing and credential harvesting is number one on this list as well, closely followed by scams and fraud. Unauthorized access in there too. I can actually just see questions just popped up, which is a really good point that I didn't make earlier in the piece. We will have time at the end to answer some of these questions. If you do have questions popping up as I go through any information, make sure you add that into the Q&A section, and I'll do my very best to get to all those questions towards the end. I will address this question that's popped through at the moment. Where does business email compromise come into the overall amount of loss for businesses in New Zealand? That's a really good question, and we are going to talk about business email compromise specifically in a little bit of time. But where this really plays a part in terms of losses for businesses, what we often see is that business email compromise will then result in something that we call invoice scams. And that's where a genuine invoice has been captured. It's been altered. Typically, all they change is the bank account number. They may also change some contact information on there. They send that off to a supplier. That supplier, depending on their own processes, may simply pay that without actually realizing that what they're doing is paying a malicious actor who has been able to compromise a business email account. Now, specific numbers around the amount of loss that that's resulting in isn't something that we can particularly capture, but what I will say isn't something that I have on hand today, but what I will say is that this is a really significant incident for organizations to be aware of. It's not just financial loss that occurs as a result of something like an invoice scam. Business email compromise can result in a lot of other serious cybersecurity incidents because business email addresses are often linked to a lot of other accounts that we have. It can often result in access to other parts of the systems, other parts of the environment. It can result in access to the data and information, and then can result in things like privacy and data breaches as well. So business email compromise is a really big issue, and we are going to talk about that specifically in a bit of time. Unauthorized access, and that's actually where business email compromise is captured in terms of the data. Website compromise is a slightly different type of unauthorized access. And then as we work down the list, we can see things like ransomware and malware. One issue that CERT NZ often has is in terms of numbers and in terms of reporting. As I say, we can only report back on what is reported to us. And so it's really important that we actually drive this reporting up so we can get a better idea of what's happening in the landscape of New Zealand, what's affecting organizations. And so if your organization goes through a cybersecurity incident, I do really encourage you to report that to CERT New Zealand, not just so that we have a better picture of what's going on, but we can provide you with some free advice and guidance on how to deal with that incident and ideally set yourself up in a more secure position moving forward. And some of this information we capture by sector, so we can actually see what's affecting individual sectors. It's not hugely surprising that the sector that reports the most to us is the financial services sector. Obviously, they're going to be a big target in the cybersecurity space. They hold information on finances. They actually hold the money themselves. Naturally, they're going to be a pretty big target when it comes to cybersecurity incidents. But you can see if we take that one out, then the amount of reporting for all the other sectors is pretty similar. And what this really highlights is that there is no sector, aside from the financial sector, that's really being singled out and being targeted. And again, what I'd come back to is the reality that we all use the internet. The internet enables our business in today's world. And what this means is that cybersecurity is something that should matter for everyone who operates on the internet, which is probably everyone on the call today. And this just really highlights that this can happen to anyone. Anyone can be a target. And again, it's less about the attackers really looking for those really high value targets and more about them looking for the opportunistic moments, the doors that are left open, the things that don't have authentication, verification on them, these kinds of things. So now if we look at the specific types of losses, the graph on screen at the moment does, again, highlight the financial loss. And what it's actually showing is the amount of financial loss per in various bands. You can see that 8 incidents in 2023 had a financial loss of about $100,000 or over, 39 incidents between 10,000 to just under 100,000, and then 68 between 1,000 just under 10,000. That's a lot of money per incident happening. And these are things like those invoice scams that we talked about, unauthorized access to bank accounts. That's a lot of money to be losing, especially in one go. But what this page actually highlights as well is that it's not just financial loss that's occurring here. There is that data loss as well, and that's where that privacy aspect comes into play. There's that reputational loss and harm against the business when they do suffer a cybersecurity incident. There's the operational impact to an organization. So maybe you can't continue doing business when you've been hit with a ransomware attack, or maybe you can't continue doing the business you would if you don't have access to the data that you need. And so that operational impact is really major as well. Technical impact too, maybe your systems need to be rebuilt, re-imaged, these kinds of things. But the one that's not captured on screen that I do want to highlight today is the emotional impact as well. When these cybersecurity incidents occur, and this can be in regards to the individuals who have had their information breached, this can be in regards to the organization and the people that have to respond to the incident, work on the incident. The emotional impact is really important to acknowledge as well. This can take a serious toll on people who have had their information breached and don't know what to do, don't know what it means for them. And this is why communication in these incidents is really key. For an organization who's dealing with a cybersecurity incident, that's partly one aspect of it is a data breach. A really important thing to do is make sure you get your communication right. And that means, one, obviously meeting your obligations, like reporting to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, make sure they're aware of what's happened and you're meeting your obligations there. But actually letting your staff know what's happened and what it means for them. And most importantly, letting your customers know what happened, what information has been compromised, and what does that mean for them. What you can often do is point them into a place where they can get more information as well. And this is something that CERT has done in the past and can do, and can support organizations dealing with privacy or data breaches. It can be a source of information for affected people to go to understand exactly what's happened and understand what they can do to keep themselves safe moving forward. And that can often be a really key part in making sure that the emotional toll as a result of these incidents is minimized as best as possible. All right, so now we're going to look at the scary stuff, the threats that businesses may encounter, the cybersecurity threats that are out there that can result in privacy breaches and data breaches. And then we're going to look at the positive stuff, the things that you can actually do to stop the bad stuff from happening. So as we're going through these types of incidents, what you will see is that there'll be a picture of someone on the right hand, maybe it's your left-hand side. What that is from is ownyouronline.govt.nz. That's CERT New Zealand's other website, from the Exposed Expose. Now, the Exposed Expose is all about bringing real stories to light. Real New Zealanders who have gone through these types of incidents, telling their story about what happened. And the reason that we wanted to really bring those stories to light is to try to help combat some of that stigma. The reality is these types of incidents can happen to anyone. I know some cybersecurity professionals who have fallen for phishing in the past and other types of incidents. All it takes is a moment of vulnerability in your life. If you've got something else major going on and that text message comes through at the wrong time, that email comes through at the wrong time, you're a bit vulnerable, your mind's elsewhere, you click on that link because you don't want to lose $2,000 from your bank account or whatever baseless claim that email or text is making. You click on that link, you provide some information. It can happen to anyone, and that's what we're trying to highlight with Exposed. The other reality is look, I can talk to people about what the impacts are. I can talk to you about the financial loss and the privacy breaches and the emotional impact and all these types of things. But when you hear it and see it from someone who's actually lived it, who's gone through it themselves, it can be a lot more impactful. Unfortunately, we do also have this, I guess, kind of myth where we often think that cybersecurity incidents aren't going to happen to us. It's part of that thinking of we're too small, our business isn't big enough, they're not targeting us, it's not going to happen to us. And so the unfortunate reality is that people often only look at cybersecurity as something that's important after something has already gone wrong. The other reality, though, is that prevention is always easier than recovery. And so if you take anything away from today, hopefully it's a part of the next topic that we're going to talk about, what you can do to keep yourself and your information, your privacy secure. If you take anything away from today, hopefully it's one of those things that you can implement yourself today to improve your own cybersecurity. And look, what we want to achieve is not necessarily perfect, but we just want to get better. We want to improve our cybersecurity. We want to put us in a more secure position. We want to do something that's going to improve the security around our information. And we don't want perfect to be the enemy of improving. So phishing is a type of email scam. It can be an email. The reality is these days it can also be a text message. It can also occur through a phone call. But it's where the person calling you, sending the email, sending the text is pretending to be a person in a reputable organization, and they're trying to get you to provide some kind of personal information. This may either be through a phone call, they're asking for that information. It may be that they're asking you to click on a link and provide some personal information. Typically what they're after are things like login credentials, so usernames and passwords, and then things like credit card details as well. What can often happen as a result of phishing is business email compromise. As I said, we're going to talk about this specifically. So if the attacker sends a phishing email, someone in the organization clicks on that link, provides that personal information, those login credentials, a username and a password. What the attacker will then maybe do is be able to compromise various parts of the organization. That may be a business email account. And I want you to think about all the kinds of information that you have in your business email account. Maybe you deal with invoices, maybe you deal with payroll, maybe the credentials that you use in your business email account are used elsewhere to access other parts of the system. We are going to talk about passwords and password reuse and the risks that presents as well a little bit later on. But business email compromise can result in a lot of other pretty significant cybersecurity incidents. Phishing results in business email compromise. Business email compromise can then result in invoice scams, can result in data breaches and data loss. It may even be the thing that results in ransomware attacks occurring as well. I also want you to think about how many other accounts are linked to your business email account, or even in your personal life. How many online accounts do you have that are linked back to your email account? If an attacker can get into our email accounts, it's possible that they can get into other accounts as well, using things like password reset features. As I kind of talked about, some of the things that can result after a business email compromise occurs, things like invoice scams, and that's those types of scams are where we see the really high value financial losses occurring. So those 8 incidents of $100,000 or more, the vast majority of those are invoice scams. And essentially, as I kind of already said, this is the interception of legitimate invoices, changing key details on there, typically payment details, and often contact details as well, redirecting that payment to a malicious bank account. Even the organizations that have good, robust practices in place and would call or email the contact details on an invoice when they see a change occurring, what the attackers will do is change that contact information as well. And so some organizations don't even realize they're actually speaking to the attacker. One really important thing that we recommend for businesses is having those robust procedures around verifying the change of details, like bank account details, having a process in place that is regardless of the invoice itself. So having a number you can call, having an email address you can contact that isn't captured from any invoices that you have in place, that's been in place for a while. And so if a bank account is changed on an invoice, you can call that number, you can send an email to that address, you can verify that change. And if it's not legitimate, you'll very quickly figure that out. And then that will actually be a bit of an alert back to your supplier or whatever organization you're dealing with, that they may have a compromise on their own business email account that's occurred as well. The other thing that'll often happen when a business email account is compromised is more phishing occurring from that genuine email address. And if you think about it, if you were to receive an email from your manager, your manager's manager, someone else that you work with that's quite trusted, from their actual email address, you may be a lot more likely to click on a link to open an attachment to provide personal information. And so phishing results in business email compromise, which results in even more phishing, which can result in a greater level of access for these attackers. It's really important we keep our business emails safe, and we're going to talk about how we can do that in a little bit of time. Talked about malware a little bit. Malware just means malicious software. And as I said, there could be a real range of different types of malware out there. It can be info stealer malware, which is trying to capture any information stored on the device that it infects. It could be adware, which is a bit of a funny one, where it's trying to run a lot of ads in the background of your device, earning revenue that way. It could be spyware, which is capturing any of the actions that are taken on the device that's affected. It could be a keylogger, which simply captures all the keystrokes on your device. One malware that we responded to at CERT New Zealand a little while ago was the FluBot malware. This was affecting personal mobile devices in New Zealand. I think at the time it infected around 200,000 of them. And what it would do is scrape the contact details held within the phone, send all those numbers back to the control server, and then that server would then have a whole new list of numbers to go out and target for their attack as well. How does malware get in? There's a couple primary ways that this can occur. Dodgy websites are one. Most organizations will have in place something that will block those malicious websites. And if you're looking for something that you can do in that space, I would encourage you to check out NCSC's malware-free networks. It's a threat intel feed that you can consume within your organization to prevent access to known malicious websites. And similarly, CERT New Zealand run a phishing disruption service as well, which is the same thing, except rather than blocking malicious websites known to try to install malware, the phishing disruption service is trying to block access to known malicious phishing websites that try to capture the information that we've talked about. A couple of options that you could look at consuming within your organization to prevent access to those types of things, so that even if someone did fall for that email, click on that link, try to go to that phishing website, they can't access it, especially if CERT NZ are already made aware of it, which just again highlights that really importance around reporting, even if you spot something. If you're someone that spots a phishing email, it's still important to report, and I would actually recommend reporting it internally first and foremost, so your organization can keep the rest of the employees safe from that phishing attack. Then reporting it to CERT New Zealand to then provide that protection wider for the rest of New Zealand as well. Aside from dodgy websites trying to install malware, email attachments can often do this. And then sometimes what we actually see is that hardware will be infected with malware. And if it's plugged into a device, it'll deliver that malware to that device. So that's why it's really important not to just plug random USB drives into your work devices. If you find something on the street, assume it's not safe, don't plug it in, hand it into the IT department, they can check it out. We have seen this happen even here in New Zealand, so make sure you're not plugging in any random peripherals to your device without knowing it's safe first. And then, of course, the big one, the big type of malware that you've probably heard about, that's often captured in the media, ransomware. Ransomware is simply a type of malware that tries to get into a system, tries to access as much of the system as possible. And what it'll do is encrypt or lock data, files, information on that system. The only way that you can typically get access to those files and to that data back is by paying a ransom to the attacker. And that's the whole aspect. That's the whole angle of ransomware attack, is lock everything down, demand a ransom, and get the payout that way. Ransomware has really developed a little bit in terms of methodologies over the years. And so we used to see that they would lock all the information down and they would demand a ransom, and that was kind of where it ended. What we now see is that they lock all the information down after exfiltrating it all. So then they demand a ransom so that you can actually get access to those files back. If you pay that, they then follow up with a second ransom demand saying, if you don't pay again, we're actually just going to release all the information online anyway. We encourage not paying any ransoms, primarily because there is no guarantee this will return you any kind of access to your device, your systems, your files, or anything like that. And actually what we've seen is that organizations that do pay a ransom then become a greater target for future attacks, but also for secondary, tertiary ransom demands as well. What we've seen is that attackers will demand a ransom. An organization makes it clear that they're willing to pay that. that's when the ransomware attackers will then say, actually, you've got to pay us more. Actually, we've taken a look at the data again, and we can see it's worth more than we originally demanded. Well, we need you to pay a second ransom. So paying the ransom is no sort of guarantee that you'll get any kind of access back. So we encourage against it. And we're going to talk about backups and how important they are, but they are really key when it comes to recovering from ransomware. That's a lot of scary stuff. That's a lot of all the bad that can occur, everything that can go wrong. So let's turn on to some good things. What can we do to keep our information safe? How can we protect data? How can we uphold those privacy obligations that we have? And again, what I want to highlight is that this is applicable both in your personal life as well as your organizational environment. And what we might be able to do is you may be an employee who, has a lot of different passwords and you find it a bit of a pain. Maybe we can shed some light on why it's so important to have those long, strong, unique passwords and do things like two-factor authentication. So let's start with passwords. CERT New Zealand recommends using long, strong, and unique passwords. That's great. What does it mean? The longer your password is, typically the stronger it's going to be. Now, we recommend at least 15 characters. At an absolute bare minimum, I recommend 12 or more. If you want to go a little bit extra, 16 characters is actually a really a good breakpoint for password strength. There's a bit of math that goes into why 16 is actually such a key breakpoint. But don't just adhere to the minimum requirement of those passwords. If you're creating a password for a platform or within your organization and it states it must be at least 8 characters long, I recommend going above and beyond. The longer your password is, the stronger it's going to be. It's also important to make sure you use unique passwords. In your personal life, just start with your critical accounts, things like your bank account, your email account, social media, maybe things like IRD. In your business space, any accounts that have some level of access to other parts of the environment, other parts of systems for your organization, it's really important to make sure those passwords are unique. And what do we mean by unique? Basically, you're not using the same password everywhere. Now, I may have just called some people out who do use the same password everywhere. I understand why we use the same passwords. Reality is, in our personal lives, we have to remember we have about 100 to 160 online accounts, any given person. No one's remembering 160 different long, strong passwords. It is important to make sure that you have those unique passwords on those important accounts. And it is important to make sure that you've got unique passwords in your business environment. The reason why reusing the same passwords can create such a risk for our accounts is because data breaches occur. So let's say you use the password across all your accounts. Let's say a platform that you're subscribed to has a data breach through no fault of your own. Now your password is out there online. If you use the same password across all your accounts are now at risk. Very common tactic that attackers will use is take compromised username and password combinations and plug them into a range of different platforms to see if you've got the same password anywhere else. Think about all the accounts you have that are linked to the same email address. Now think about whether or not they have the same password. If that password were to get out there through a data breach or anything else like that, all of those accounts are now at risk. If you use the same password across all your personal accounts and you use it across all your business accounts too, all those business accounts are potentially at risk as well. So how can you create a better password? Most people like to use a password that's based on some kind of personal information. I think the most common methodology is pet's name, date of birth, exclamation mark. That way I've got uppercase and lowercase letters, I've got numbers, and I've got a symbol. It's meeting all those complexity requirements. It's probably going to be long enough, and it's still something that I can remember. The unfortunate reality, again, is that attackers know we like to follow these common patterns. So if they can find that information on public social media accounts, what they'll do is they'll take that brute forcing software or software that just guesses a really high amount of passwords in a really short amount of time, and they'll plug that personal information into that software. And what that software will now do is generate a really long list of passwords to guess in a short amount of time, but based on that personal information. And if your password is a pet's name and your date of birth, very likely that that personal information is going to get captured, and it makes guessing or cracking that password just that much easier for the attackers. You could consider using a passphrase, so 4 or more random words. That's going to meet that length requirement in most cases. And it's going to be something you can actually remember. It's just important to make sure that those 4 words aren't personal information. No street name, no pet's name, no maiden name, these kinds of things. If you need to add numbers and symbols, then we recommend adding those at random points in the password. We know that people like to add 1 at the end of their password or an exclamation mark at the end of their password to tick that box. Attackers know that too. And if your organization has you changing your password regularly, I actually recommend having a chat to the security team. It's far better to have a long, strong, and unique password in place. It's important to make sure that that is actually in place, but it's better to have those passwords than it is to change them regularly. What people will do is if they have to change their password every 3 months, we've all probably done it. You chuck a 1 on the end, 3 months rolls around, you change that 1 to a 2. Another 3 months, you change that 2 to a 3, so on and so forth until you get to 13 like I did in my previous job. That's not a very secure practice when it comes to passwords because, again, attackers know we like to follow that pattern. That's why it's important to avoid those common patterns and avoid using that personal information. And a tool that you can use to figure out if your passwords have been breached is haveibeenpwned.com. It sounds weird. It's an odd-looking website. I wouldn't blame you if you thought that was malicious. It is a genuine website. There are some agreements between various government organizations here in New Zealand and the owner of that website. And what the site does is actually collect data breach information. It doesn't display that information, but what you can do is plug your email address in there, and it will tell you anywhere that email address has been caught up in a data breach or a compromise, and it will tell you what information has been breached and what information has been compromised. Plug your email address in, you find out that your password that you used on Twitter 3 years ago was actually caught up in a data breach. You realize you still use that password on a number of accounts today. Those accounts may be at risk, and it's important to go away and change those passwords. So that's a really useful tool to help us understand whether or not our passwords are nice and secure. I can see a number of questions rolling in. We will have time at the end to address those, and I'll do my very best to get to all those questions there. 2-factor authentication is the next really important security control. Now, it may be called multi-factor authentication. It may be called 2-step verification. It has a lot of different names. It's all kind of the same thing, and it's an extra layer of protection for your accounts, for those login credentials on top of the password. So password's our first layer, but we can, again, follow that defense in depth model by adding layers of protection on top of that. Key is multi-factor authentication. The most common form that this looks like is you enroll a phone number as part of the account. When you log in, that phone number gets sent a text message. That text message contains a code. You've got to plug that code in, and then you're able to actually log in. There are various different forms of multi-factor authentication. Some are better than others. The reality is it's more important to have any form of 2-factor on your account than what form you actually choose to take. There are apps out there that can do this as well, so authenticator apps. It'll generate a code. You have to plug that code in to be able to log in. Sometimes what the apps are now doing is that the website actually generates the code, and you have to plug that code into the authentication app. What this means is that even if we click on that phishing email and we provide our login credentials, attackers still aren't necessarily going to be able to get into our accounts because they can't get through this layer of defense. They can't get through that 2-factor authentication unless they physically have our phone. It's not foolproof. You may have heard of the Uber breach that occurred, I believe, last year. It may have been 2022. And that occurred by way of multi-factor authentication fatigue attack is ultimately what it was called. An employee at Uber at some random time in the morning, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., they were getting crazy amount of 2-factor authentication requests. It got to the point where they were so fatigued by it that the person that was claiming to be part of the IT department that just needed them to hit approve so they could get access, they decided to hit approve so they could make the request stop. And that was how the attacker was able to get around that multi-factor authentication layer. What this can also serve as a bit of an alert. So if you get a 2-factor authentication code or a challenge popping up and you haven't tried to log into your account, this means someone else is trying to log into your account. This probably means that your password's been breached. You can use haveibeenpwned.com to go check that out. And you probably need to change that password. But it's not just that layer of protection, it gives you that alert as well. In terms of security controls, multi-factor or 2-factor authentication is one of, if not the most powerful control out there. And so in your personal life, again, I really recommend getting this implemented on those important accounts, those critical accounts. And if you're asked to use this within your organization, I definitely encourage you to do so. Even though it can be a pain, look, I do it every day. I have to do it multiple times every time I log in, and it is a pain, but I understand how powerful it is and just how much it can protect us. And so I go through that process every single day. Updates are also really important. Security vulnerabilities are a thing. They are regularly popping up in various pieces of software. CERT NZ does a lot of work around vulnerabilities and reaching out to organizations that may potentially be vulnerable. But you can actually circumvent that whole thing by just making sure that your systems, your operating systems and your software are kept up to date with the latest update from the vendor as soon as possible. We've all done it. We've all had that pop up in the bottom right-hand corner of our screen or the top right-hand corner of our screen saying there's an update for your device. Do you want to install it now or do you want to install it tonight? And we've all hit, tell me later. We've all hit that 7 times until we've reached the limit and now our device just completely shuts down on us so it can go through those updates. It is important to install those updates as regularly as possible. So maybe you're working on something critical, finish off that piece of work, save those documents, and then shut down that laptop, make sure it gets that update so it can address those security vulnerabilities. Phishing is the #1 intrusion vector that we see. So capturing those valid credentials. We've already talked about how to sort of protect against that. We need to make sure our passwords are unique. We need to make sure we've got long, strong, unique passwords so they can't be guessed. And we need that extra layer of protection and two-factor authentication. And that's going to serve to protect us against phishing, against the use of valid credentials as the main intrusion vector into our organizational environments. But vulnerability exploitation is the second most common. And we can kind of get rid of this risk by making sure we are installing those updates regularly as quickly as possible from the vendor. We can actually do this automatically. So we can set it up that those updates will install automatically so we don't even have to worry about it. We can set it up to install overnight when we're not even working. And making sure we have those updates as quickly as possible from the vendor is key to making sure we're not at risk of those security vulnerabilities. So the next time you have that pop up, remember this chat, finish off the work you're working on, save it away, and then make sure you are installing that update as soon as possible. Privacy. Privacy webinar, and we're talking about privacy. That seems a bit funny. Privacy is important, especially when we start to think about our social media presences. Most people these days have some form of social media. Social media is a trove of personal information, and as we've sort of already touched on, attackers will use that personal information to try and compromise our accounts, to try and guess and crack our passwords. And so it's important that we take privacy into our own hands, especially in our personal lives. I would recommend to most people locking down your privacy settings and just making them private. So only your friends, only the people you know can actually see the information that you have. Now, that might not work for you. Maybe you have a side business that requires you to have a social media presence. And so separating anything that's business related and personal related out from one another is really important. But if you can't lock down those privacy settings, just understanding what information you're putting out there, who can see it, and what it might mean is really, really important. So if you do opt to use personal information in your passwords, and I do strongly encourage against that, but if you do decide to use your pet's name in your password, it's important to make sure that can't be found online. It's important to take action in terms of your own privacy and lock those social media settings down so only the people you know, the people you trust can actually see that information. The other thing that I would really encourage, and this used to be a much more powerful red flag to look for, no longer the case. But actually just checking for that padlock symbol when you're on a website. So you may see at the start of a URL, it says HTTPS. That means there's a secure connection, which is really important just to make sure that's there. Now, unfortunately, the reality is the presence of that doesn't mean you're not dealing with a malicious website anymore. The presence of that does mean that anything you are sending to that website is kept encrypted and secure. So it's important to make sure that that is there. Like I say, just because it's there doesn't mean you're not dealing with a malicious website, but it not being there almost guarantees you. The last tip that I want to talk about is just taking a moment to stop and think. We get that text message. It claims there's an urgent issue on our bank account, claims a transfer of $1,000 has been processed, and that we need to click a link in order to cancel that. Attackers, scammers will try to create that sense of urgency, and this is a social engineering tactic to try and get us to click on that link to make us more likely to click on that link, make it more believable. Try to get us to act out of that fear, out of that urgency, and take some kind of action that they're trying to get out of us. But it's important to take a moment, get that text message, stop and think about it. There's a few things you can look at. The link it's asking you to click on, does that look like the website that it's trying to take you to? The email address it's come from, does that end in a domain that looks like the legitimate website? Or the number it's come from. Have you received a number from a really big reputable organization, from a personal mobile number? Excuse me. It's a little bit unlikely that a really big organization that has thousands, tens of thousands, 100,000s of customers is going to be individually sending text message through a personal mobile number. Much more likely they're going to use a text service, which will mean their text will come from a short code number, 3 or 4 digits long. If you received a text message from one of New Zealand's biggest banks and it's come from an individual mobile number, more likely than not, you're dealing with a scam. Taking a moment and actually thinking about the things that we can look at, like, does this narrative actually make sense for me? One of the biggest tech scams going around at the moment is claiming to be from NZTA that you have some tolls to pay. Have you traveled on a toll road? If you haven't, it's a good indication that it's got nothing to do with you. Texts that claim to be from Westpac when you bank with ANZ, good indication it's probably not legitimate. But actually just pausing for a moment, taking a deep breath, having a read over the message, acknowledging what it's asking you, checking whether or not it makes sense, maybe even having a chat to a friend or family member and saying, hey, does this look right to you? Does this look legitimate? Sometimes just taking that moment is all that we need to do to be able to spot these things, not giving into that sense of fear or that sense of urgency, because the reality is, if we don't engage with a text message that's from our bank is going to contact us some other way. Maybe they'll give us a phone call, maybe they'll send us an email. Not engaging with a message, with an email, with a phone call is not the end of the world, and an organization that needs to get in touch with us will have another route to do so. If you get an offer that seems too good to be true, it probably is. Text messages out of the blue, emails out of the blue that claim there's a really great lucrative investment opportunity, that's probably a scam. And so just, again, taking a moment, stopping and thinking, double checking some things, having a chat to someone near you, this can be the key to actually spotting these things and not falling victim to them, not clicking on that link and not providing those credentials. There are a bunch of other tips out there specifically for businesses to help you sort of maintain your privacy, maintain your security, and keep that information nice and secure. All this information can be found on ownyouronline.govt.nz, a link to which will be on the very next slide. And I don't know if these slides are being shared. I'm more than happy for them to be shared, so you can actually navigate to that link and see the rest of this information. We've covered off a number of these, but there's a few additional ones on there and a few that I'll call out specifically. Excuse me, having really robust backups in place, so backing up your data, backing up your files, that's a really important step to take. It means that if you did suffer something like a ransomware attack, you can restore from those backups and you can get back to normal operation as quickly as possible. But it also helps you meet your privacy obligations. If you do suffer some kind of attack that exfiltrates or encrypts your data, having a backup in place means that you still have access to at least a version of that data and helps you meet some of those obligations. Aside from that, having an incident response plan in place is a really important one too. And the level of your response plan may depend on your organization's size and scope. It may simply be knowing who to call when something goes wrong. Having that written down, having that in place can be really powerful when it comes to a cybersecurity incident. When something goes wrong, it can incite a lot of panic and a lot of fear and a lot of worry. And so having a step-by-step guide on this is what you need to do now can save precious time in terms of that recovery. Another really important one that I just want to call out quickly before we move on to the questions that have been flowing through the whole time, which is great to see, is changing those default credentials. So if you have anything in your business, any kind of solutions or hardware that come with default credentials, so admin is unfortunately a really common combination for default usernames and passwords. If you have anything that has those default credentials, changing those is really, really important, especially if it's internet facing. Attackers know what these default credentials often are and will use, again, that low-hanging fruit. They'll look for internet-facing systems or services that have those default credentials that haven't been changed, and they will try to use that as a way into your organization's environment. Changing those default credentials are really important to do. As I said, link to the Own Your Online page for these tips on your specifically for businesses, and I encourage anyone who's curious to go check that out for a bit more information. contact details on the page now, but we did have a number of questions coming in, so let's see if we can't address a few of these now. Okay, so the first one here is all around, does data reported or data breaches reported to the Privacy Commissioner get passed on to CERT New Zealand? No. The simple answer is no. If you report to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, as far as I'm aware, that simply stays with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Is there a piece of work where we could maybe look at combining these things? Yep. Of course, that's going to have its own privacy obligations. You'd have to tick a box and make it okay for that information to be shared. But no, there's no automatic process where information passed on to the Privacy Commissioner is then passed on to CERT New Zealand. So if you are looking for that free advice and guidance, meeting your obligations is the most important thing. So reporting to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner when these things occur is really key. But if you are looking for that advice and guidance and maybe some tips on how you can be more secure moving forward, I definitely encourage you to report to CERT New Zealand at cert.govt.nz. Could you please make these slides available or the recording available? As I said, I'm more than happy for these slides to be shared with all the attendees, anyone who's curious to get those. So I'm absolutely fine with that. We'll defer to privacy on that front to get that sent out. Do you see a time when payment of ransoms will be made illegal? It's a really interesting question, and different jurisdictions have different policies around this. I believe there are some sanctions on paying ransoms. I'm not fully across that myself, but what I can just echo is that we really strongly recommend against paying those ransoms for a number of reasons. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get anything back. It makes you a more likely target in the future, and it's contributing to that financial incentivization of these cybersecurity crimes. Rather than paying a ransom, I would encourage you to look at investing that money now in some secure practices, whether that's offering a password manager to your employees so they don't have to remember all their passwords. Maybe that's implementing two-factor authentication on really important things. Maybe that's implementing some kind of update installation process or having a robust backup system in place. Look at investing that money in prevention rather than recovery, and you're going to be in a much better position. For the password safety, should I also invest in a YubiKey, USB-C YubiKey? That is a physical implementation of two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, and it's a really, really powerful control to have in place. So whereas typically you'd have a phone and you'd get a text or a message sent to that phone, you have to enter that code in order to be able to log in. The difference with a YubiKey, and it just looks like a little USB stick, is that it's something that you have and you need to have it on you in order to gain access to that account. You log in, you plug the YubiKey in, typically you have to push a button on it. Some even have a thumbprint scanner on it, and you can only access the account if you have that. That is a really powerful implementation of multi-factor authentication, and would definitely encourage you to consider purchasing YubiKeys for your employees as an additional layer of security. To what extent does multi-factor or two-factor authentication negate the need for password managers? Would you respond to someone who says that because of MFA, the reuse of passwords is less important? It is a powerful security control, multi-factor authentication. It can go a long way to helping reduce the risk around passwords. But again, what we come back to is that defense in depth model. And I'm tripping over that word quite a lot. Defense in depth. Having multiple layers of protection is going to make you much more secure. So if you have multi-factor authentication in place, does that mean I can go out and I can use whatever passwords I want? Ultimately, no. As I said, the Uber breach is a great example of how social engineering can be used to try and capture multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication codes. Again, highlighting the importance of taking that moment to read the messages, see what they're actually asking of you. But having multi-factor authentication and having good password procedures, either making sure your passwords are long, strong, and unique yourself, or having something like a password manager on board as well. These are going to benefit one another. They're going to give you a greater security posture and keep you just that much more secure. So I would always encourage looking at a defense in depth model and layering these things on top of one another than just looking at one solution on its own. Interesting question here. I believe the safest password is one that doesn't exist. Any ideas on alternative authentication methods? This is something that's being talked about quite a lot at the moment in security circles. One interesting thing that you could go have a read on is FIDO2, FIDO2, as a new standard for authentication. There's a lot of chatter about whether or not passwords will be something that we continue to use in the future, and I can't tell you whether or not we will. But there is a reality of when we allow people to create passwords, they're going to do what's easy. They're going to do what they can remember. That is basic human nature. So on one side, yes, the best password is one that doesn't exist. On the other side, I make the argument that a password you don't have to generate yourself is better than one you do. This is where a password manager can play a really important role. You do have to remember one password, but just one password. You can put all your effort into remembering and making one password that's long, strong, and unique to keep all your other passwords safe. The password manager will then generate the other passwords for you, making sure they're all long, strong, and unique, and you don't have to worry about remembering them all. I would definitely keep an eye on the space for what security looks like in the future and whether or not we depart from the classic password-based security as well. Do you think two-factor authentication via text message is more risky due to eSIM being available and SIM swapping? Absolutely. As I said, not all two-factor authentication methods are made the same. Text message-based multi-factor or two-factor authentication is prone to a little bit more risk than other forms typically are. As you say, SIM swapping is a thing. So social engineering a call center rep of a telecommunications organization to get your number swapped over to a different SIM doesn't occur too much here in New Zealand, touch wood. It does occur, and this is one way that attackers can go about capturing multi-factor authentication codes that are sent via text message. So if you have the option, I would definitely encourage you to look at alternatives like authentication apps, or even that physical authentication through YubiKeys that we've discussed, as an alternative to text message-based 2FA. But what I would come back to is that having some form of 2FA or multi-factor authentication is still more powerful than having nothing. If the only thing available to you is text-based 2FA, I would still encourage you to implement that as a second layer of protection. Does onepassword.com not also present the same issue as other password vault app services? If they are breached, attackers would have access to your details. Very good question. I actually believe LastPass had a breach in recent years, and this raises an interesting point. Number one, password managers should never be storing passwords. In fact, organizations in general should never be storing passwords in plain text. They should always go through some type of algorithm or process to mask what the password actually is. Hash values, salting and hashing, all these kinds of things. Won't get into the technicality of that, but those passwords should be stored not in plain text. What that means is that if they do have a breach, if something is to occur, someone gets a hold of the information that they store, they can't see the passwords for what they actually are. And all those algorithms and things that I talk about should be one way, so they can't be reversed. It does still mean that there's other personal information that can be captured. So in the case of LastPass, things like first name, last name, email address, mobile number, the accounts that you had passwords on, that kind of information was available in that breach. And what that means is that the customers may be at an increased level of risk for ongoing or future phishing attacks and targeted phishing against them. But the passwords themselves shouldn't be at risk in that case. Again, it comes back to the standard advice around password breaches. If your information has been caught up in a breach, understanding what information has been captured and how that might be used against you is really, really important. Another question around, yes, please, can we have the slides? Absolutely, again, more than fine with that. Sorry, there are quite a few questions in here. There's a lot around password managers, especially around password managers that have been hacked. What's a good password manager? And things like, is Apple's password manager or built-in password managers a good option to consider? What I'll use is Google Chrome as an example. So Google Chrome has a built-in password manager that you can use. You can save your passwords to Google Chrome. There are some pros and cons to using something like that. It's not the most secure option, but there are some things that you can do to make it a much more secure option. If you choose to use Google Chrome as your password manager, so you save your passwords there, what that means is that your Google account, your Gmail account, has essentially become your password manager account. So now you need to make sure that that account has a master password on it, has a password that's long, strong, and unique, and is going to keep all your other passwords nice and safe because that's now what it's being used as. I would definitely encourage you to implement some level of two-factor or multi-factor authentication on that account as well. Get that additional layer of protection if you're using it to store all your passwords. The other consideration you need to make is making sure Google Chrome is kept up to date with the latest update as soon as possible. It's now storing all your passwords. There may be vulnerabilities that pop up in future that put those at risk, and so getting the latest update is really, really important. Aside from that, the next consideration you need to make is, do you stay auto-logged into your Google Chrome account? What that means is if you lose a device where you are auto-logged in, if someone else gets that, they may be able to get into all the accounts that you've saved in that password manager. So consider not auto-logging into your Google account. But if you do, you absolutely have to make sure any devices that account is auto-logged into are kept secure themselves. If it's a laptop, make sure the operating system is kept up to date. Make sure the laptop is protected by a password, a code, biometrics, something along those lines. If you do these things, you are making it a more secure option. But again, I would consider a password manager a third-party password manager. Some key questions to ask for a password manager. Do you offer two-factor authentication? Do you generate passwords? Do you store passwords in plain text? Check out their history. Have they had a breach? Maybe that's a deal breaker for you. Maybe how they handled the breach is helpful. Simply Googling a list of top password managers, looking at a few different lists, finding the ones that are common there, picking one to look at particularly, and then asking those key questions. Have you had a breach? Do you have 2FA? How do you store passwords? All these kinds of things is really, really important. I'm so sorry, but I see that we have run out of time. I know there's a few more questions in there. I'm more than happy to try and answer these questions offline, and then maybe we can send the answers back out. I'll work with the team at Privacy to see if there's an option there. Thank you so much for joining today. Hopefully you've taken something away, something that you can go away and implement today to improve your security and therefore keep your privacy intact, keep your personal customer important information nice and safe. If you are looking for a CPD certificate, then make sure you email privacyweek@privacy.org.nz and they can get you sorted out there. Thank you so much again. I will do my best to get these slides sent out to all the participants along today. Good, everyone. Have a good day.